Hello, it's Chris Wadsworth here again. I'd like to tell you another story. This one's about Bill Peascod, a Maryport man, whose whole life was based on rock. He hewed it out of the earth in the coal mines of West Cumberland. He climbed rock faces. In fact, he was one of the early pioneers of some of the most difficult climbs in the Western Lake District, and he made wonderful paintings so textured that you feel you can almost climb them. My story begins in January 1986. If you look in the middle of this photograph, there's a farmhouse hiding among those trees. It's on the northern slopes of Skiddaw, and it had just come on the market. This was the first house we decided to view. We were moving north from Bristol, and the views were spectacular in every direction. The single-track road to Eilbeck's farm was a bit tricky, especially as there was snow on the ground. Suddenly the road swooped down a steep hill with a bend and a lethal stone bridge at the bottom, before it climbed steeply again to reveal our destination at the top. The car had skidded a bit on the ice underneath a thin layer of snow, and Michael started fretting about getting to work in winter. We were greeted by a young Japanese woman, Etsu, and her lovely little daughter, who would be about 7 or 8. Etsu led us through the glazed conservatory, which was strewn with serious climbing gear. There were boots and ropes, crampons, ice axes, and even skis, and took us into the large, comfortable room with a roaring fire and a sandstone flag floor. A long oak table with about 12 dining chairs round it stood at one end, but it was the painting on the stone wall behind it that immediately gained my attention. It was large and it was textured, semi-abstract, and I couldn't take my eyes away from it. I turned to the fireplace and was entranced by an equally large and equally impressive snowy mountain. Richly textured it was again. That must be gesso, I thought, to achieve that effect. It was pleasingly understated, left a lot to the imagination, but you could feel the wind and the cold and the rocks under your feet. I looked at Etsu and said, who painted that? Oh, that's my husband, she said, and we carried on through room after room, with views to die for out of every window, and paintings to die for on every wall. We went into this study, and this painting was hanging on the wall. It was smaller than the other two. I recognised it immediately. Oh, that's on the way up to Skiddaw, I said. We climbed it from the Keswick end last week. Ullock Pike, she said, and took us outside into the yard and pointed. It's good skiing up there when there's a bit more snow, but it's too rocky at the moment, it's dangerous. We went out into the farmyard, Skiddaw towering above us. The middle building is a barn, a large barn that was almost derelict, but Etsu informed us that they had planning permission for accommodation and painting courses, but work had not yet begun, because we can't afford to do that, Etsu said sadly. But I can show you the architect's drawings. It'll be lovely. Come over here and I'll show you the milking parlour. That's the white building on the right. But it wasn't a milking parlour. It was now a working studio. She opened the double doors, and there was a brazier full of ash in the middle. It's a very big room, and a lot of work in progress. There were all the trappings of an artist: brushes, paints, tools, mysterious potions. A smell of oil paint was in the air, as well as linseed and turps. Some of these were roughly hung on the walls, and I recognised some of the half-finished works as local views. There are still many people in Keswick who remember going to that studio and learning with Bill. This one was finished. Where's that? I asked. Oh, it's Burtness Combe down the Buttermere Valley, said Etsu. One of Bill's favourites. He did a lot of climbing down there. Something was worrying me. I didn't quite know how to broach this, but I said, Etsu, as you're selling this lovely house, where are you moving to? Oh, we haven't decided yet, she said. Maybe Bristol or Edinburgh. I'm thinking about Emma's education. There was a pause, and then I couldn't help it. I said, you know your husband won't be able to paint like this there, will he? Etsu looked at me, this pretty young woman, and she said, Bill's dead. I don't want to stay here without him. It's so isolated. It's not good for Emma, her education. And I'm lonely. I was devastated. What could I say? I was almost in tears, and so was she. We left, and Michael quickly took me off for a pub lunch, and I cried into my half-pint of lager. I cried for all the paintings he would have painted had he lived. He was too young to die, I said to Michael. I assumed he was the same age as Etsu. Next day, driving back to Bristol, I called into the estate agents in Keswick. They hadn't given me any names for the house we'd viewed. They just gave me the particulars and made an appointment for me. So I asked them whose house it was. Oh, said the agent breezily, that's Bill Peascod's house. You know, the climber. He died on a mountain somewhere last summer. It was all over the press. I think he's just had a biography published. Shame that, he said, shrugging his shoulders. Well, as soon as I got back to Bristol, I shot down Park Street after I'd parked the car, into the bookshop and asked if they had it. I didn't know the title, but the assistant found it straight away. Oh, that's Journey After Dawn, he said. Bill Peascod's autobiography. It had been published just months before he died and just weeks before his 65th birthday. The young man told me he was an admirer. He'd read it. I rushed home, I put the kettle on, sat down at the kitchen table and started to read. And do you know, I couldn't stop. Bill Peascod wasn't the young man I'd imagined him to be. There was a photo of him in the field behind the farmhouse where I was only yesterday. There was a recent photo of Etsu, who I found out was his second wife, with little Emma at Drum House above Honester. It was all there. It was all the more poignant because I'd just been right there and I couldn't put it down. I finished it about 4 o'clock in the morning and went to bed. By that time, I knew a lot more about Bill Peascod. He was born in this house in Maryport in 1920. There's going to be a blue plaque on there quite soon, I gather. Bill's mother died of TB when Bill was 9. He left school at 14 and followed his father down the pit. It was a hard life, but that's what West Cumbrian men did. They either went out in the boats fishing or they went down the pit. With the absence of any transport, people on the coast had never ventured into the lakes and fells. Bill, as a child, read copiously. Dickens, D.H. Lawrence, Rider Haggard, Tarzan of the Apes, anything he could find in the local library, who got to know him quite well. He was into escapism and adventure. At 17, after a hard night, he made a decision that changed his life. I'd actually like to just read you the paragraph from his biography rather than just try and tell you about this experience, because it was rather dramatic. He writes, I'd been on the night shift. When I came out of the pit into God's real air, the morning was so beautiful I couldn't bear to go to bed. I cycled home, had a meal, then my bath, where my father and I always bathed, in a tub in front of the fire. I got dressed and onto my old broken-down bike my father had bought me for 5 shillings, and I set out towards the sun. On that day, at 17 years of age, I discovered Lakeland, and it was a revelation. All my life I'd lived within 15 miles of the Buttermere Valley. I'd never seen it, or thought about it, or even considered going to it. It was like London or Mars. I knew it existed, but there had never been any point in going to find out where. On this day, I worked my way through the lanes of Dean and Ulloch and over the Mockinkin Fells. As I breasted the hill, the whole panorama of the beautiful valley began to unfold. Below me, Loweswater, and the hazy fells slept in a gentle dawn. From high up on Fang's Brow I could hear the valley sounds, voices of man and beast, the clip-clop of a draught horse. Apart from them, all was still and totally at peace. After a night spent in the darkness and turmoil, among the sweat and stink of stale air, pit ponies, and one's own pit shirt, my discovery of Western Lakeland set my senses in a whirl. From that moment my thoughts and needs took wings. All my spare time was given to extending the limits of my world of discovery, on my bike, on foot, and in my dreams. That's quite a lovely poetic passage, isn't it? This is Bill at 17 with a coil of rope round his neck, and I don't know, I can't see his feet, but he after scrambling up quite a few hillsides and trying to get to the top, he'd realised he needed more flexible shoes, and he bought himself a pair of plimsolls at Woolworths. He climbed alone for quite some time, which was quite a dangerous thing to do, especially because that coil of rope round his neck, he'd no idea how to use it, and without a partner, it wouldn't be much good to him anyway. He would fall. But look at his hands. He's got miner's hands. They're big as spades, and very, very strong. He was just a natural climber. But one day he had a stroke of luck because he was going out there whenever he could on the bike and just finding his own way up things. He'd no idea what he was doing really. And he saw a man in a car driving slowly the other way. So he turned his bike round, pursued him, and found out that this man was also an amateur climber, and he was called Bert Beck, and he was a teacher. He was a schoolmaster in Workington, and what's more, he had a car. So Bill and Bert Beck became a formidable partnership. Bill pioneered and named most of the classic climbs, and they were in the Buttermere Valley. He and Bert Beck did first climbs on Cleopatra, Delilah, Eve, they're all biblical names, Resurrection and Eagle Front, among many. This is the young Bill climbing Cleopatra in 1951. As you can see, it's extremely precarious. That one makes me quite dizzy. He's got his rope tied round his waist. I don't know whether he's learned how to belay it anywhere, but there you are. And this is Bill on Gillicombe Buttress in 1950. He lived for weekends climbing, and he was ambitious. He wanted to claw his way out of the mines. He began studying mining, and in 1950 he became a full-time lecturer at Workington Technical College. But he had itchy feet and ambition for something better. He always thought there was something better around the corner. He picked up an advertisement one day. It had been put there by the Australian government promoting a scheme where people with skills could get a £10 passage to Australia. Bill looked into it, and with his wife Margaret from Maryport and young son Alan, who was age 9, he took up the offer, and he was accepted. It was a long voyage all that way, and on the way there were two people that he got very friendly with, Les and Jill Zitara. They were going to the same place, Wollongong, on the coast south of Sydney, and they became lifetime friends. Bill was coming. He got a job as a lecturer in mining at Wollongong Technical College, and Les was coming as a GP to the same place. Bill had done his homework, and looking at maps and books, he'd managed to find out that it was very similar to West Cumbria. It was a coastal town, about the same size. It had mines there. It had hills behind. And so he thought he could probably take up his climbing again. But when he got there, he was bitterly disappointed. Yes, it was mining, it was on the coast, it was a town like Maryport. It did have a hinterland of hills, but no equivalent to the Lakeland Hills. These hills were covered in bush and wildlife, and there was water, there were lethal spiders, and you needed a machete to get anywhere near anything. He was very homesick, and he and his family had been given temporary accommodation, and Bill started to paint, just pale watercolours. I saw some of these early paintings when I went to Wollongong. I'll tell you about that later, but they were filled with bleak loneliness. Anyway, he worked hard and he got better qualifications in mining technology, but he was still going nowhere, and his wife Margaret didn't settle. He confessed later that he too missed Cumbria every single day of the 20 years he was there. He decided to take an art course at the same college that he was lecturing at. And in 1960, he had his first one-man show in the WEA rooms in Wollongong. He then took off and had shows in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. Here is Bill when they'd moved out of the immigrants' camp, and he'd built a house for them in the hills, not that far from Jill and Les Zitara, strangely enough. And these are some of his first paintings when he decided to go bigger and better. He started to paint in oils and other textured paintings because he was looking for texture. You know, he was a climber. He wanted texture on things. And he ruined quite a few boards with his different potions and so on. And then one day he tried to scrape off a board. He'd got no others left, and he thought he'd scrape it off and then he could reuse it. But it had dried and it was difficult. So he took a blow lamp to it and then watched fascinated as the paint began to melt and move. And he moved the board a bit and it trickled. And he found he could manipulate the paint on this board. And that's what he became famous for. He called them the burnt paintings. He had his first exhibition of burnt paintings in 1963 at a gallery in Sydney, and the critics loved it. It was something new, and he gained an international reputation. He won the Rubinstein Prize to do an art tour of Europe. By 1970, the national galleries were acquiring his work. He had more than 30 solo shows in Australia, 3 art awards in 1 year. He represented Australia and South Africa and the USA. And then he was invited to do a solo show in Japan. He loved the Japanese aesthetic. Things were not going so well in his marriage. Margaret had never really settled. So over he went to Japan, taking the paintings with him. It was a successful exhibition. He came back to Australia after that, but he really wanted to go back to Japan because he loved the minimalism there. So he decided to return. He put in an application to study at the Kyoto Sacred College of Art. And there his work changed and developed, and he embraced minimalism. He stayed in Japan for more than a year, just over a year, and during that time he met a fellow student, Etsu. In 1972, Etsu came back with him to Australia, and a year later they were married. They were very happy together, despite the big age difference between them. It really didn't matter. And little Emma was born in 1973. There she is, in the studio in the hills above Wollongong. The painting behind her really relates more to the burnt paintings, the one with the red in the middle. except he was moving on from that. And then the painting on the right, next to Bill, is embracing Japanese minimalism. So Bill's work changed. The burnt paintings disappeared, but the texture remained. This diptych called Glen of Weeping is massive and impressive. It's very large. I think it's about 12 feet by 6 feet in 2 pieces. And I had it hanging at the gallery for some time and absolutely loved it. But it was not really a painting on a domestic scale at all. And in the meantime, Reged opened near Penrith, a sort of visitor centre, and they installed a climbing museum at the top on the 2nd floor. And they saw the Glen of Weeping and asked if they could borrow it for the museum, which Etsu and Emma agreed to. By that time, Emma was at Art College in London. And they came and took it over. Unfortunately, they hadn't really got the space to show it either. And they hung it at the top of the upper escalator. And it wasn't that well lit. And I think people going up in that escalator, you're always concentrating on getting off it when you get to the top. And so very few people actually saw it or studied it. This is Land of the Leel, and you can see the Japanese influence there. And also this one, which is one of my favourites, called Wilderness. That one, you feel as though you hang gliding over the landscape and that the landscape will go on and on forever. He became very, very successful. He doesn't say whether he gave up mining or mining lecturing or whatever, but he did become very successful. And of course, when they got more money, they could afford to come back to the UK and see friends and relatives, which they did. The first time he brought Etsu back with him, he took her down the Buttermere Valley, of course, and she was captivated. They got to about here in the Buttermere Valley, and that looks like Fleetwood Pike straight ahead of us and Haystacks to the right. But it's all very vague. Nothing is absolutely definite, which is what you like about them, because you can make your own story to every painting of Bill's. But Etsu was just overcome and asked him to stop the car. She wanted to get out. She got out and just studied what was round about her in that beautiful valley. And when she got back in the car, she looked at him and she said, "You know, this is what you've been painting all these years. You've not been painting Australia or Japan. This is what you've been painting." In 1980, Bill was 60 and he was entitled to a pension. So they came back to England permanently and found and bought Melbeck's. Sitting there at the table in Bristol, it was just incredible to hear what they'd done to that house, how they'd renovated it and so on. And Bill set up a studio in the milking parlour and began to give lessons to groups. Yes, I know, I'd been in there. This is Blencathra. They did most of the work themselves on Melbeck's, and Etsu had been heaving slabs of sandstone. She'd lain that beautiful sandstone floor. But Bill had had 2 mild heart attacks, and he'd been warned by the medics to give up climbing, smoking and drinking. But of course to him that was unthinkable. He wanted to live life, not rest. Here is one, a beautiful painting called The Lake. I think that is looking north to the Lawton Fells, and I think that's Ranadale Knott on the right. But who knows? Does it matter? That's what I always say to people when they wonder where the artist sat to paint this or that or whatever. But once Bill had got the Melbeck's sorted, and he'd met up with lots of old climbing pals as well, and he was painting his heart out and earning a living teaching art in the milking parlour. This is him on Cleopatra Wall at Buckstone How. Above is the photograph I showed you some pages back of Bill leading the first attempt at Whitsuntide in 1951. And on the left, you've got Bill in the same place in July 1982. Not quite the same place, but almost, I think, yeah. And this is Bill with David Craig in 1980 on Shepherd's Crag. He was exploring all the routes that he and Bill Burkett had set down. He met up with his climbing friends again. And here he is on Great Flake. This one makes me dizzy, I'll give you a warning. But you can see why I was completely engrossed in this autobiography. I'd had the privilege to have been in that place and met Etsu and Emma. It was all live in my mind. I saw it all. In 1965, he was invited to take part in a 6-part documentary called Lakeland Rock. Some of you might have seen it. It was hosted by Chris Bonington, who in each one of the series made a climb which was led by a climber who represented a decade of climbing. And that climber could choose a favourite climb. Bill was asked to take on the 50s, and he chose Eagle Front. Now, Eagle Front is a particularly hard climb in the Buttermere Valley. It's difficult because the face is north-facing, and the sun never reaches it. So Bonington and Peascod had to use the gear used on their original climb. Well, this was tricky, because it was really wet that day and the rock was very greasy. Bill soon abandoned the Woolworth plimsolls early on, and he did it in his socks. One wonderful bit, there he is on Bonington's shoulder, but there's a wonderful bit where he actually stands on Chris Bonington's head, and Chris Bonington's head appears to almost disappear between his shoulders, and I think he lets out 1 or 2 expletives. But some years after this, after Lakeland Rock, I met Adrian Bailey in London. And, I'll show you at the top first. There they did, they made it, man, said Chris Bonington, and disappeared behind a rock. Bill had forgotten that to persuade him to do it, Bonington had promised him a surprise at the top, but that had gone from his mind in all this wonderful climbing and wonderful views. But Chris Bonington reappeared with a bottle of champagne, which they popped and had a few drinks straight from the bottle, and there was a little bit of friendly kind of badinage between them. I met the producer and director of the film, Adrian Bailey, in London some years later. He'd been in the helicopter above, filming and directing. He told me that when I got home, I'd to look more carefully and note where Bill secretes a half-empty bottle in his pocket. That was the 3rd take, he told me, and the 3rd bottle to be uncorked and toasted. He thinks that they fluffed the take on purpose, and it got more and more hilarious. I think they were lifted off in the helicopter. But of course, they'd started that day very early to actually cover the climb, while Bill was still fresh and could do it. And then afterwards, they filmed the opening sequence, which was Bill riding down from Newlands Hawes into Buttermere Village on a 1950s bike that they'd found somewhere in a junk shop. Well, Adrian Bailey told me how they were above in the helicopter, and Bill gathered speed on this bike, coming flying down from Newlands Hawes. And he'd got that false confidence that alcohol gives you. And he let go of the handlebars at one bit, and the bike went one way and he went the other, and he tumbled down the bank. Of course, the crew found it hilarious when they realised he wasn't hurt. At that point, I'd finished the story of the life of Bill Peascod. I closed the book and went to bed. But it wasn't the end, was it? But there was no Google and no World Wide Web, no computers, so I didn't know what had happened next. I called on Etsu on my next visit north and told her we'd be making an offer on Eilbeck's farm. She seemed delighted, but when we made it formally through the agent, it was turned down. We were puzzled and too embarrassed to confront Etsu. She was so polite, typically Japanese. We couldn't bear going back there. We were grieving for that farmhouse, and it took us another 9 months, and I can't count how many numbers of viewings before we bought Castlegate House. And then one day, I'll show the champagne on the top. Sorry, I forgot to show you that. But I don't know which bottle that was, whether it was the first or the third. But then Bill, when they've both had a swig of it, puts it in his pocket inside his jacket. Anyway, one day, when the gallery was up and running, I think it was perhaps a few months in, not as much as a year, I got a phone call. "Is that Chris Wadsworth?" said the voice. Yes, I said cautiously. "Do you remember me?" Gosh, it was Etsu. "Etsu, where are you?" "I'm in Edinburgh. I've heard that you have a gallery and I hear good things. We never had a memorial for Bill, but now the time is right. I don't want to sell any works, though. They're too precious to me. What do you think?" Well, I was in the car and off to Edinburgh in record time. It was then that I discovered that our offer had never been put to Etsu. Why, I asked myself. She kept asking the agent what had happened about us, but only met with obfuscation. She didn't know where we were. We were actually in a rented house in Pardshaw. And it had taken her well over a year to sell. We both exchanged what had happened to us, and she thought I'd had a narrow escape because she said the water froze in winter and its source was unreliable and the shower was temperamental. She told me all this over a beautiful Japanese supper she'd cooked, sitting on the floor of the flat in Edinburgh, and we looked at paintings, and we talked and we talked. Gosh, all my wishes had come true, but it's very expensive to put on an exhibition, and this was early days of the gallery. I realised I had to get sponsorship to do it, but where? Well, it was obvious, wasn't it? I approached the coal board. They were creating havoc in West Cumbria at that time, digging up land for open cast, and they needed goodwill. So they agreed, much to my surprise, immediately. Melvin Bragg agreed to open it. Chris Bonington said he would contribute, make a speech and contribute to the catalogue. And we had an opening for the mayors, the MPs and councillors. Food and wine flowed, and everybody was very happy, of course. Bill's climbing friends came. There were every climber I'd ever heard of and a great many more that I hadn't. They were legendary names. Most of the climbers that were involved in the Lakeland Rock film, Joe Brown, Don Whillans, Bill Burkitt, they were all there. The Visual Link, a film company in Carlisle, helped me make a shortened version of Lakeland Rock and splice in some other lengths of film we had. We had Bill on the top of Nape's Needle in Wasdale, a film that Alan Hankinson had made, and some film that had been made in Australia with Bill being interviewed in his studio by the Australian equivalent of Melvin Bragg. Drink flowed freely, and climbers are thirsty people when not hanging on a rock face by their fingernails. I learned a lot more about Bill. In the photograph, you've got Etsu, obviously, to the left, then Melvin Bragg. On the right, you've got Chris Bonington, and the very tall man in the middle was from the coal board. Very nice man. But 1985 was a significant year for Bill. He'd enjoyed his 65th birthday party on the 3rd of May. The Lakeland Rock film was shown on Channel 4 just before that. His autobiography was also published just before that. And he died on the 17th of May. Don Whillans rode into the car park at Castlegate House on his famous motorbike for that opening. And after a few drinks, he told me about Bill's last climb. An old climbing mate, Don, and Bill had agreed to meet up in North Wales and climb Great Slab on Cloggy. This is the last photograph ever taken of Bill. Don was leading when Bill, who was climbing number 2, shouted to say he felt a bit dizzy, and then the rope became very, very heavy. Don lowered him down on ropes with difficulty. Looking at that, you can see how difficult it must have been. Bill was quite stocky and heavy, and he lowered him over a few overhangs to a narrow ledge where the number 3 climber was waiting. He gave him resuscitation, but to no avail for over an hour. Of course, there were no mobiles, there was no means of getting help. They then gave up and had the terrible task of getting him off the near vertical terrain. Don Whillans told me that they laughed and they cried on the way down. I suppose it was all the emotion coming out. After this reception for the exhibition, I drove Etsu to Bassenthwaite churchyard afterwards, and we had a look at Bill's rough slate headstone. At home, in the steep places, was carved into it. And then we went up to Eilbeck's farm, which was deserted that day, to see where Bill and Etsu and Emma had made handprints in the wet cement of the yard. That was the first time I dared to go back. I looked at the view and I sighed. It was wonderful up there. But you can't have everything, can you? Or can you? In October 1993, the phone rang in the early hours. I picked it up sleepily. Guess who this is? It was Etsu. Etsu, I'm not playing games. It's the middle of the night. Where are you? I'm in Australia, she said, very brightly, and Bill's speaking to me. Etsu, can you tell me about what he's saying in the morning? But he wants another exhibition, she said. I've been going through Bill's papers. He apparently left a lot of work lodged in the big national galleries in Australia. I think they belong to me, not them. Will you help me redeem them? She was now living in Sydney. Well, how exactly, Etsu? Are you in next Friday, she said. Yes. I'll come and see you 11 o'clock. She walked in only about 10 minutes late, which, as she'd come all halfway around the world, was pretty good. We agreed to go over there in January, when the gallery was closed, and give Bill a retrospective the following year, 1995. This time, she wanted me to sell quite a lot of his paintings, and it was an exciting trip. I was allowed into the storage rooms of some impressive galleries. I went to Wollongong to the gallery there. We stayed with Les and Jill Zitara, the friends of Bill who had been on the £10 voyage to Oz in 1952. They lived in the mountains close by. They had a keg of whiskey on the veranda and a tame wallaby who visited them every day. We drank the whiskey, not wallaby. And Les was so proud that he'd planted an avocado orchard and he was actually having his first crops from there. It was a lovely visit, and there was a Peascod painting on their sitting room wall, Blue Lake. I'm still in touch with them, and I emailed them during the recent terrible fires in Australia to check that they're all right. Les told me that Bill had dragged him off to the mountain above Blue Lake one day and had led him through his first climb. In 1980, it was, just before he and Etsu flew back to the UK for good. This is the painting. It's not. Here it is. Sorry about that. So here's Blue Lake, that painting. And this is Les making his first ascent. And it was his first climb ever. And I said to him, how did you feel about it? He said, I was terrified. That's the boot in the photograph is Bill's as he urges Les on. and Les is down the hill in a white helmet. In 2000, I was looking for a hideaway, as the gallery was becoming very successful and very busy, and I needed to escape the constant pressure of living over the shop. I looked for several months, well, actually just over a year, I think. And then, what a surprise, Low Melbeck's house came on the market. It sits across the field from Melbeck's farm. I took this photograph just from that's our fence on the left-hand bottom corner, and I took this photograph across. You can see Bill's studio on the right, and you can see Melbeck's farmhouse in the middle. The barn is hiding among the fields. So Low Melbeck's house was once occupied by a climber and friend of Bill, Alan Hankinson, and it looks up at Skiddaw and Ullock Pike, and across to the cowshed studio of Bill's. The house was derelict. A whole corner had fallen down. Because of that, I could just about afford to buy it. It has a stream running through the garden and lots of rare and wonderful wildlife. Once again, the agent, a different one, tried very hard to stop me buying it, but I persevered and got it. What is wrong with the Cumbrian agents? It has given me 15 years of joy, and I had come full circle.